These are the real problems with Sorcerer.
Suspense, adventure, mystery, danger, courage. Sorcerer. Roy Scheider in a new film by William Friedkin. Sorcerer. Rated PG. Starts Friday at a theater near you.
Sorcerer was released in 1977, and it is from the director William Friedkin. Now, that name may sound familiar to you because we had William Friedkin featured on a previous episode, and that was The Real Problems with The Exorcist. Now, it may seem like there's a ongoing comparison with a lot of these movies, and it's a sense that some of these directors keep showing up, because it always seems like there's a pattern between a couple of them. And I'm looking at you, James Cameron. And obviously, William Friedkin suffers from the same kind of ideology of making these movies. They go pretty hard in the paint, and they are pretty extreme about how they film things. And Sorcerer was a movie that, I have to be completely honest with you, I'd never heard of it before. I may have casually come across it, back in the day on cable or something, and may have noticed that Roy Scheider was in it, but all in all, I completely forgot about this movie. But there's been a lot of talk about it recently, and so I went to go look it up, and I also noticed that William Friedkin was the director, and when I noticed that, I said, wow, how did I miss this movie? Because this movie came out after The Exorcist. It came out after The French Connection, two movies that I happen to love and really enjoy from this director. So I thought, how did I miss this movie? So I went and I actually watched the movie, and I've got to tell you, this movie is pulse-pounding sheer entertainment from start to finish. It is so nerve-wracking. It has just certain quality to it. It's real gritty, real grimy. Basically, the story is based off of a book, and there was an older adaptation of this particular book. I believe it was called The Wages of Fear. So if you want to read the book, that's what it is called. But the movie itself was something that I really enjoyed. Basically, the plot, it involves 4 different characters, and each of these characters are at different locations in the world. Like, one of them is in France, one of them is in Israel, one of them is in New Jersey, another one is in South America. And each of these gentlemen have created or caused a crime, a serious crime, because none of these guys are good guys. These are all villains. They are all murderers. They are all thieves and something to the like. I mean, none of them are good guys, but each of them have created a catastrophe for their own personal well-being that they have to flee their respective countries. They have committed crimes so nefarious that they have to go to the South American jungle. And in this particular jungle, there happens to be what I would like to call a safe haven for criminals. And these guys, they go there and they decide to wait out any kind of heat that they may have with the police, and they just wait it out. And apparently this is some kind of unspoken agreement for a lot of people, so they all flee to this centralized area. But what ends up happening is that they were there for so long that they've lost a lot of rights, due to their respective citizenships. There becomes a situation where one of the people that works and runs the camp says, hey, we have found 3 massive packs of nitroglycerin, and we need somebody to transport this nitroglycerin to another camp because it could be very profitable. It's illegal, so their in line comes with the danger. I mean, not to mention the fact that it could just explode at any minute. So what ends up happening is that these 4 men conveniently are selected to drive the trucks. There's 2 trucks, 2 sets of nitroglycerin packs in each truck. And what they end up having to do is they have to drive through some very dangerous rocky terrain, jungle marsh areas, sides of mountains, over these crazy suspension bridges that are just so dangerous. And everything that happens in this movie from that point on is just so tense. And then the violence, it's so gory, it's so gruesome, it's so shocking. And there's some things in this movie that transpire that I wouldn't give away in case you want to go watch the movie, where my jaw dropped. I just did not expect it to happen. It is an absolute thrill ride. I love this movie. I highly recommend you watch this movie. The movie is called Sorcerer. Now, I know that the title itself may lead you to believe that it is some kind of like fantasy film. Is this some kind of Lord of the Rings Willow type of a deal? But it's not. And that's actually one of the first things that was a problem with the movie, was the title. The studio wanted William Friedkin to change the title, for starters, because they said, look, Sorcerer doesn't make any sense. That makes it seem like it's a fantasy novel, but it isn't. And apparently what Friedkin said was that the Sorcerer title is the name of one of the trucks. It's the name of the front-running truck that's leading the charge. And it's almost supposed to imply something like Gandalf, who's leading the Fellowship to Mount Doom. That's some pretty underlining stuff. You would have to know your sci-fi fantasy for that kind of stuff. They didn't want to argue with Friedkin because, again, this guy just made The Exorcist. He's made The French Connection. He's just scoring on all these hits. The title Sorcerer stuck, and they move on to production with that. Now, this is, of course, The Real Problems. And on Real Problems, we talk about production issues. And just like The Exorcist and probably The French Connection, if I went and dived a little bit deeper on it, Sorcerer had its own share of problems. Of course, it starts out with shooting on location. He wanted to shoot it in the jungles of South America. There's a lot going on in there. There's a lot of very dangerous nature. There's a lot of dangerous guerrilla warriors and soldiers who are not by any means under control of the government or any kind of police regulations. There's a lot of corrupt cops around the area. He wanted to shoot in local villages that were also overrun by drug cartels. Didn't matter. Friedkin wanted the authenticism, and he had his actors coming in from all locations to congregate in this one area. And that actually created the first problem with his lead actor. He initially casted Steve McQueen. Now, Steve McQueen is a classic actor. You know, he's Bullet. He was in a lot of other movies. And Steve McQueen had said to Friedkin, is this not something that we can shoot in California, or at least in America? And William Friedkin went back and forth with him on this and said, no, I need to have it look like the South American jungle because it's set in the South American jungle and nothing around here really properly conveys that geographical terrain. So right off the bat, McQueen was kind of against it and he didn't really want to sign on the dotted line. But then his last contingency to accepting the part was his wife, Ali McGraw, at the time, needed to have a part. He wanted her to have a part in this movie. And again, Friedkin, who co-wrote the script, said, look, this isn't a film featuring women. This is men in a South American jungle prison. There's probably like 2 or 3 women, but they have to be local actors. Or they don't even have to be actors. They just have to be locals, look the part. They don't have to be actors. So he was already pissed about that. So he says, well, forget it. If you're not going to give Ali McGraw a role, I don't want it. I don't want to do it. What ends up happening is Roy Scheider, who is popularly known as Chief Brody from an all-time classic film, Jaws, he comes in and he's already worked with Friedkin before, worked together on The French Connection. And Friedkin said, hey, I've got another part for you. And I know you haven't been wanting to play police officers anymore, and you really want to sink your teeth into something a little bit more villainous or more multi-dimensional characters. So I have a character here for you. He's a bank robber from New Jersey who ends up going to a jungle in South America and has to transport nitroglycerin packs to another area of the jungle in South America. Would you be interested in that? Roy Scheider had no doubt in his mind. He said 100%. This is exactly the part that I was looking for. So he at least had his lead actor and an American actor that he can put in the forefront for the promotions, for the posters and stuff like that, because his other actors were Israeli-born actors, French-born actors, so they were people that weren't really known if you're not part of an international film community. If you're just looking at a movie being distributed in America for the time, you really need an American actor to be on the posters, to do all the promotional interviews and everything for the movie. So Roy Scheider was his guy. Within the first 10 minutes of Sorcerer, Friedkin takes us on to Veracruz, Mexico, Jerusalem, Israel, Paris, France, and New Jersey, United States. It was a massive undertaking that became a logistical black hole for the production crew and the cost of the film. Now, for a great many of the members of the crew, it was a job that they most likely wish they hadn't taken. Whenever there's an international shoot, things can get pretty dicey because they don't really have the same kind of rules and regulations that most union members did here in the States. They feel a little bit more protective in terms of what they're supposed to be doing and what they're supposed to be working on. Now, Friedkin had all the reason in the world to be confident that he could pull off this project. He was closely linked to what this whole theory called the New Hollywood movement of the 70s, and it seemed like a natural extension to take on this globe-trotting tale. I think he felt really encouraged to be part of that New Hollywood movement, to do something so big and so grand in scale in terms of a global shoot. So Friedkin originally wanted to make the bulk of the movie within Ecuador. Now that didn't really happen because it was immediately known as a subtropical country that was deemed far too dangerous for the filming. So the location was moved to a more humid, insect-infested jungles of the Dominican Republic, which as it turns out was just as dangerous, but for different reasons altogether. Now, during the exhausting shoot, this included bouts with, of course, severe weather, and much like the Island of Dr. Moreau. If you haven't heard the Island of Dr. Moreau episode, there's some similar issues with the terrain and the climate. It always seems like severe weather and rainstorms always really affect any movie set within the jungle. Now, this was no different. They had to deal with thunderstorms, and luckily they had minimal sets because everything that was already on location was pretty much there to begin with, so they were just basically filming what was already there. approximately 50 members of the cast and crew developed gangrene and other illnesses and had to be hospitalized before eventually being sent home for a multitude of weeks to recover. To determine the severity of gangrene, I even looked up the definition just to give you an idea of how crazy this situation, this affliction is. Now, the definition states, it's the localized death and decomposition of body tissue resulting from either obstructed circulation or bacterial infection. 50 crew members suffered gangrene and other serious illnesses, and to have to deal with something so life-altering, I'm sure that they were compensated by the insurance agents, by the union standards and stuff, but oh my god, that's just so brutal and nasty. So that was already creating a high level of tension and frustration behind the cameras. This was difficult for a lot of the crew to come in and support Friedkin in some of his more difficult locations, but not wanting to miss out on the epidemic of potentially fatal diseases going around on the set, Friedkin himself was stricken with his own debilitating illness. Now, the director said in a Variety piece toward the end of the shoot, "I contracted malaria. The picture went way over schedule and budget." Despite all the problems he was already dealing with some of the technical aspects of the film, being stricken with malaria had him set aside in a South American jungle for about 2 weeks. Nobody was filming anything. Everybody was getting sick, so they decided to use this time to try and recover as best as they could. They had to recoup their losses from the crew, bring in new crew, ones that were, of course, brave enough to deal with a shoot such as this one. In Friedkin's absence, it should be noted that some of the crew got bored and it ended up being drug runners for some of the local drug cartels, and they were suspected of doing so by the local governments, and even the local government didn't appreciate these American crew members coming in and taking some of their jobs, so they had them sent away. So not only were they having to deal with crews being sick, they were dealing with crew members being corrupt and dealing drugs on the set, but they just simply fled back to the States and had to be replaced yet again. And if the crew wasn't sick or evading jail time, they were being canned. And it's just already known for a volatile personality that earned him the nickname Hurricane Billy. William Friedkin, in full dictator mode out in the jungle, routinely was firing people left and right because he was just tired of how the shoot was going. It wasn't in his best vision. And the firings included production managers, teamsters, stunt people, and anyone else who was just basically pissing him off. And even his own longtime line producer wasn't safe from his firing tirades. Now, his first cinematographer, Richard Bush, was replaced during production because Friedkin was not pleased with his work, and he had been working with him for years. And he even got into it with Roy Scheider, even though they got along well during French Connection. Scheider would later joke he was the only person Friedkin could not fire because he was the leading man. Even Scheider himself said that the famously troubled Jaws production was a picnic compared to Sorcerer. Now, let me tell you, this is a preview because Jaws could have a 2-part episode of The Real Problems with all of the difficulties that they had to face, Spielberg and the cast and crew filming with Jaws. And there's been documentaries made about the filming of Jaws and its troubled production. Now, for Roy Scheider himself to say that filming Sorcerer was more difficult than that, I mean, it had to be pretty bad. Now, there were considerable challenges that came when shooting the film's most incredible sequence. Now, this is the nitro-carrying trucks. They had to cross a rickety rope bridge over a raging river. Now, the initial river chosen in the Dominican Republic was nixed because it was bone dry due to a drought in the country. The production decided to move to Mexico for this particular stunt. And they found a river that looked appropriately intimidating. However, after the bridge was constructed, the water began to dry up and the river became no more than a trickle. So perhaps the production was cursed. Now, to compensate, Friedkin had to fake the river by pumping thousands of gallons of water into it, while also utilizing rain machines and hoses to create the powerful rainstorms that were splashing onto the road. Now, the shaking and swaying of the bridge was achieved by placing hydraulic mechanisms underneath to stimulate its flimsy nature. And oftentimes the trucks themselves were attached to the bridge in order to keep them from slipping off. If you watch this movie, this particular stunt is the most iconic moment of the movie. It is so tense, it almost looks like a miniature truck on a miniature bridge, how they filmed this, but it is all real. You had stunt drivers. The whole thing was practical. And when you watch it, you're just blown away by how this happened. Now, the trucks themselves, if they weren't falling off the bridge, the drivers were getting rocked. And even one of the stunt drivers fell out of the window onto the river embankment that they had created. He didn't severely injure himself, I mean, he got right back up. He was a champ, and he went right back up, right into that truck and got back onto it. But just the fact that they had to simulate this crossing of the bridge, if you don't do anything but just go to YouTube and watch this particular sequence, it is exhilarating. And knowing that there is nitroglycerin in the back of the truck, I mean, granted, it's not real, of course, but in the state of the movie, it just makes it even more exciting. What was funny is that even before the stunt drivers got into the truck, they were kind of afraid to do the stunt. And Friedkin himself said, I could drive this truck across. Just let me do it. Now, Friedkin drove it across himself to prove to them that it could be done. And while they didn't fall into the river many times, while Friedkin was in the cab, the actors were often actually driving the trucks themselves and at least steering them. And somehow none of them were ever seriously hurt. Now, while none of the actors fell into the river, and many times Friedkin was in the cab in the back with them just to kind of, I guess, show some camaraderie for the stunt, the actors were often actually driving the trucks and at least steering them, and somehow none of them were ever seriously hurt. Now, the two bridge scenes together, lasting about 12 minutes in the film, took several months to complete, and it chewed up about $3 million of the movie's growing production costs. Again, this is 1977, so $3 million is quite a bit. Now, another one of the movie's key moments is when the trucks arrive at a gigantic fallen tree that's blocking their route. Now, this is a giant sequoia oak-looking tree. I mean, it's huge. Now, the only solution for the characters to get past this tree is to use some of the nitro to blast it to smithereens. Now, the production hit a snag when it turned out that they actually didn't have nearly enough explosives on hand to put a sizable dent in the tree because, as we know back in the day, there's no CGI. If there's an explosion in a movie, there's going to be a real explosion. So Friedkin wanted this effect to look so grand, and he just wanted bark and just tree branches just to look like it's just disintegrating into the air, and he really wanted to blow it up. And like I said, they didn't have enough explosives. So instead of calling in some other kind of professional, William Friedkin himself called a disreputable associate of his from New York to help. His associate isn't part of the union. He isn't part of any kind of reputable stunt team. He is actually a known arsonist who is nicknamed Marvin the Torch. And he blew up buildings for people looking to collect insurance money. And although he was supposedly retired from this questionable line of work, he still flew all the way to the Dominican Republic armed with a couple of suitcases filled with quote-unquote beauty supplies. Now, at the end of the day, Marvin detonated the tree. The explosion was spectacular. If you see it on screen, it achieves the effect exactly like Friedkin wanted. Like this tree that was actually there, it just looked like brittle all over the place. Marvin detonated it, and the torch was back on a plane a day later. I now want to play an interview that William Friedkin had done with Nicholas Winding Refn that I didn't share earlier in this podcast because he tells a story about the locals that sounds a little bit better from him than it does me.
I always looked at making a film as both an adventure and an education. And the people who came along with me shared my feelings. Right. They all could have done other simpler films. They could have filmed Doris Day in bed with Rock Hudson if they wanted. But they chose to come with me on these very dangerous adventures.
And the crew you had, was that your usual crew?
To a great extent.
Okay.
The camera operator, who was a Cuban guy named Ricky Bravo, who photographed the Cuban Revolution at Castro's side.
He was your operator?
He was the operator, as he was on French Connection and Exorcist.
Okay.
And then I took him as the operator on Sorcerer. But, so I was about to tell you that when I arrived in Tuxtepec for the bridge scene, I see what appeared to be hundreds, and was, in fact, hundreds of people leaving with sacks over their backs. And I said to my guide, who was Mexican, is this a holiday? I mean, where are they all going? And he went, I said, no, why are all these people from the village leaving? He said, because the director of The Exorcist is here. And it was a very...
What a metaphor.
They were a very religious people then.
Did you care?
I was... I didn't want people to leave their fucking homes.
No, but...
Of course I cared.
But not enough to leave.
No.
Because you got a movie to make.
Yeah, but, you can't help what people believe.
Sorcerer was released in June 1977. The studio, as I mentioned, they took a big gamble with this movie, increasing the budget over and over again. And unfortunately, William Friedkin's big gamble did not pay off. The reviews were rough. A lot of critics who previously lavished his films with great critical acclaim were really hard on this particular film. I don't know if it's because they didn't really understand the context of it or the motivations of the characters or whatever it may have been. It's pretty jarring in terms of violence, but I think the real culprit of the failure at the box office was that it was also the same summer that the first Star Wars was released, and it was released just a month earlier. It was well on its way to becoming the cultural phenomenon that it became, and pretty much any movie that was released after Star Wars that summer basically just got washed away because Star Wars stayed at number one at the box office for pretty much the entirety of the remaining 1977 year. You can actually watch Sorcerer on Prime Video. It's only available to rent as of right now. There have been a lot of legal battles in terms of who owns the rights. They didn't know if William Friedkin had a property value stake in it or the studios own it. And unfortunately, William Friedkin wasn't able to settle things before he passed away. Now, that's not to say who owns the property of the film or distribution rights, because I actually heard that they are in the process of restoring the film for its first ever 4K upconverted cut. So that's going to be exciting. I'm sure they're going to be packing it with some special features, but the cult status of this film has been quite remarkable in the last few years. Be looking out to hear it. And not only is it a cult phenomenon, but I actually wanted to play one more final clip of comedian Bill Burr going to see this movie at Quentin Tarantino's theater. And I want to play it because his reaction is pretty much the same as mine, and it's quite hilarious.
I actually went and I saw a movie last night. I call it the Tarantino. It's the Vista. French just call it the Tarantino. You want to go to the Tarantino and go see whatever? So we went to go see Roy Scheider in Sorcerer, I believe was the name of it. I'd never heard of the movie. Didn't even know the name of the movie or what it was about. My buddy's like, you got to see this. It's fucking amazing. And it was amazing. It's from the same director. I'm not going to fucking try and butcher the guy's name. He passed away last year. William Friedkin? Yeah. I was thinking maybe this was pre-Jaws. I have no idea. It was actually post-Jaws. It was 2 years after Jaws came out. And it looked like it must have been a brutal shoot in the rain, in the jungle. I don't know where the fuck they shot this thing. But it's just it reminded me of The Dirty Dozen, Papillon, and Midnight Express all at the same time, like all into one fucking movie. It was fantastic. And it's the thing that I love most about going to either one of Tarantino's theaters is every single time it's an amazing movie. Can you say that at AMC? No, you cannot. Can you say that at Lowe's? Can you say that at Showcase Cinema? I don't think you can. Like watching a movie. Where and a lot of times in movies, I get like frustrated, where they just keep creating another obstacle and everything. I get frustrated sometimes as a moviegoer, just being like, just fucking, how many times can Freddy Krueger get back up again? Just fucking kill the guy. You're going to build this tension all over again? It drives me nuts.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Real Problems Podcast. If you're not already subscribed to us, please do so on any of your podcasting platforms such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Amazon Music, or anywhere else where you listen to your podcasts. We're now streaming everywhere, and apparently we're streaming globally, so that's fantastic to hear. Please follow our IG and TikTok pages at real_problems_podcast, and you can follow me at cinema_Steven on IG and TikTok. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me at reelproblemspodcast@gmail.com. I'll kindly address your emails on future episodes. And also, if you can go ahead and leave us a star rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that would be such a big help. It helps us get heard more. The algorithm puts us in the mix with some of the big shows, and the streaming numbers have been doing really great. And I want to do more, as I usually do. And I'm going to go ahead and preview one for next week. I'm really excited about this future episode. It's actually one that I've been wanting to do since I started this podcast, but I've been holding on to it for this very specific reason. Now, the movie's going to be the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974. It's my all-time favorite horror film, and I'm specifically waiting until October 2024 to do so because it is its 50th anniversary. Didn't want to miss out on such a milestone. And let me tell you, there's so much that went on to this little indie flick from 1974. You're going to be blown away by the by the details, some of the grime, and it was just such an insane shoot by director Tobe Hooper. So that's going to be coming out next week to celebrate its 50th anniversary. If you like this show, also please listen to the Screen Addicts podcast. That is the show that I co-host with TV Viegas as we talk about film, television, and pop culture of that particular entertainment department. That show's been going on for 8 years now. So that's the long-running hit show that we have been doing for such a long time, and it actually helped inspire doing the Real Problems podcast. So without Screen Addicts podcast, there'd be no Real Problems. So please listen to an episode or two of that. It's updated weekly, and that is also streaming on all podcasting platforms. So again, thank you for listening. I am Cinema Steven Sosa, and that's a wrap.
In a world of box office blockbusters and binge watching, a duo of friends have assembled together to watch everything ever created. They are the Screen Addicts, and they are here to deliver a podcast that is insightful, comical, and the greatest sound your ears will ever hear. Prepare to empty your watch list, as the Screen Addicts podcast is here to be your guide. Now streaming on all available platforms or wherever you get your podcasts.